Right. All right. And I'll just wait a few moments to allow a decent amount of people to join us before I begin. Hello, everyone who is here. As people continue to filter in, I won't wait too long so that we can get this conversation going. So that said, hello to everyone who's here already. My name is Bashan. I am part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Before we do begin, I have a couple of quick items that I want to mention. The first of which is that if any of you have already pre-ordered a copy of White Borders, the publishing date has been moved to October 12th. So you'll be able to come to PNP and pick up a copy of your book on that date. And if not, meaning if you have not already pre-ordered, you can go to the chat section in this Zoom event, and you can click on the link, which will take you directly to the Politics and Prose website, where you can pre-order a copy of White Borders. We, of course, highly encourage you to do so. We thank you for your patronage as that continues to allow us to bring you these events. And of course, you know, why stop at one? Buy multiple copies, buy one for a friend. The last item is that throughout this event, if you'd like to ask a question to either of our authors, we would ask for you to place it in the Q&A box just to help us facilitate the question and answer period when it arrives towards the end of the event. White Borders is the first book to show that immigration laws in the US have always been motivated by racial exclusion and the desire to save the idea of a white America. Racist anti-immigration policies from the border wall to the Muslim ban have left many Americans wondering, how did we get here? In a sweeping account, Reece Jones reveals that although the US is often mythologized as a nation of immigrants, it has a long history of immigration restrictions that are rooted in the racist fear of the great replacement of whites with non-white immigrants. After the arrival of the first slave ship in 1619, the colonies that became the United States were based on the dual foundation of open immigration for whites from Northern Europe and racial exclusion of slaves from Africa, Native Americans, and eventually immigrants from other parts of the world. Reece Jones is a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow and a professor and the chair of the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Hawaii. He has researched immigration for over 20 years and is the author of Border Walls and Violent Borders, over 24 journal articles and 4 edited books. He is the editor-in-chief of the journal Geopolitics, and he currently is in Honolulu, Hawaii. Mr. Jones will be in conversation with Brendan O'Connor. He himself is a writer and a student in geography at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is, he is the author of recently released Blood Red Lines, How Nativism Fuels the Right. He writes frequently for publications like The Baffler, The Nation, and Vice, and his work has also appeared in The Guardian, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. Without any further ado, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction. My name is Brendan O'Connor. First, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the unceded land of the Lenape people. I also want to thank Politics and Prose for hosting this conversation and Reece for inviting me to speak with him about his excellent new book, which I know that I will continue to refer back to in my own journalistic and scholarly work. Needless to say, the history of race and immigration in the United States is a deeply complicated, knotty subject. Reece's book, White Borders, is an invaluable resource for anyone attempting to think through this history. The story he tells is focused without being overly narrow, clear without oversimplifying or being reductive, and urgent, not in spite of being grounded in the annals of American history, but because of it. As the images of Border Patrol agents running down Haitian migrants in Texas last week should remind us, Not only do the economic, environmental, and political conditions that displace people from their homes across the global South endure, but the violent response that awaits them when they arrive in the United States has not dissipated simply because Donald Trump is no longer in the White House. So with that, I want to put my first question to you, Reece, and ask about one of the first major shifts in the way that immigration in the United States is regulated and legislated, from something with contested and indeterminate jurisdiction to something that fell to the federal government to manage. How did this shift happen, and how did the early history of immigration shape what was to come?
Yeah, aloha. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here at Politics in Prose. Thanks, Brendan, for agreeing to join me to discuss this. And I'm really looking forward to a conversation with you because you have such a deep knowledge of a lot of these topics, having written Blood Red Lines just this year. So this is great. Yeah, I think that in order to understand our contemporary situation with immigration, with borders, we really have to look at it in a historical context, because we often forget what the laws were like when the United States was founded. And I think a lot of people just assume that the US has always had immigration laws. And that's not the case. For the first almost 100 years that the country existed, there were not any federal restrictions on immigration to the country. Instead, there were state level restrictions, but those were really uneven. States like Massachusetts and New York tried to implement limits on the poor coming from Europe. Southern states had limits on free Black people entering their territory. California tried to have some limits on the Chinese. But the Supreme Court ruled in 1849 in the passenger cases, and then again in 1875, that immigration was a federal concern. And so from 1776 until 1875, there were no federal limits on immigration at all to the United States.
In those early laws, when they were being implemented or attempted to be implemented at the state level, or by colonies, were there were they racialized in the way that they would come to be once it became a federal concern, or were there different sort of measures of acceptability for migrants?
It varied state by state. Of course, the Southern laws about free Blacks are clearly very racialized, trying to prevent seamen on ships from arriving in those colonies or early states. And then the same thing with the early efforts by California to restrict Chinese immigration. That's very much a racialized thing. But for the northern states, Massachusetts and New York, when they're having their limits, it's more about wealth. It's about restricting the entry of people from Europe that they felt would be a drain on the coffers of the states. So they were focused on the poor or the infirm that would be public charges. So there was, I think, less of a racial factor for those states. But again, those laws were invalidated in 1849. So, and many of the other states didn't have any laws at all. So it's really a patchwork at the state level that gets invalidated fairly quickly.
As immigration becomes something that the federal government is concerned with and becomes increasingly, but in uneven ways, something that is addressed and discussed at the level of national politics, there's two figures in the late 19th century, 20th century period that you discuss in your book that have really stuck in my mind as exemplars of early anti-immigrant reaction. And those are Dennis Kearney and V.S. McClatchy, each of whom seem to foreshadow in different ways contemporary figures. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about these two men, Kearney, the union organizer who was himself an immigrant from Ireland, and McClatchy, the media mogul.
Yeah, so both of them are living in California and both become very concerned with Asian immigration to the United States. So Kearney is in the 1870s when there are no federal immigration laws in place, worried about Chinese arriving. The Chinese started to come after the gold rush as immigration routes across the Pacific became possible after California, and then Oregon and Washington became states. And by the 1870s, there were about 100,000 Chinese people on the West Coast, and there was a widespread backlash to this arrival. And so Kearney is representative of that. And he is a Trump-like figure. He is, in 1878, he takes a tour of the eastern states, arguing for a ban on Chinese immigration to the country. And if you look at his rallies, he would hold these boisterous rallies with thousands of people there. And he'd start off the rallies by criticizing the media in the back, talking about them as liars and scoundrels. In some of the rallies, the people in the crowd would beat up the media figures in the back of the covering the event. Then he criticized capitalism in a way similar to Trump's criticisms of trade and the effects that has on workers. And then he always ended his speeches by saying, and whatever happens, the Chinese must go, right? And blaming the Chinese for diseases and for taking the jobs of white American workers. The other figure you mentioned, V.S. McClatchy, he comes a little bit later on. So he is he's the publisher of the Sacramento Bee newspaper. So the most significant newspaper in the capital of California at the turn of the century, really. And he eventually becomes the president of the Associated Press. And he uses that platform to push for a complete ban on Asian immigration. So that's achieved in 1917. The US bans all Asian immigration to the United States. And he continues to push for restrictions on the Japanese. And then after those are put in place, on Filipino immigration to the US, because the Philippines was still a colony. And so people from the Philippines could come to the US. And so he has this kind of lifelong effort to ban Asian immigration to the country.
Yeah, this is I don't want to say a recurring theme, but something that crops up repeatedly over the course of the history that you tell, and probably could be, it is, there are books written about this, about the way that representation of immigrants and immigration in mass media kind of constitutes and shapes and encourages reaction. But I'm curious how, somebody like V.S. McClatchy and the way that he used his editorials and his position at the top of newspapers and news services really seems to prefigure our contemporary right-wing media ecosystem. I'm curious, how has that changed over time? How has the role of media in representing immigration and responding to nativist impulses changed over time?
That's a good question. So I'm not necessarily a media scholar, so I'm not sure that I can make a sweeping account of how media has changed. But I think the thing that really strikes me from looking at these periods is how much has unfortunately stayed the same, right? I mean, if you were to pull out the speeches from 1882, when the US finally passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the ways that the Chinese were represented, it's all about the Chinese take jobs. It's an invasion that's looking to displace American culture. They don't assimilate into America. It's like oil and water. And they bring diseases with them. They corrupt Americans by using drugs. Opium dens at the time were the thing that was so feared. So the language could be swapped right in for a right-wing description of immigration today. I mean, the exact same language is the same ways that immigration is represented in the media today. So in some ways, it was depressing working on this book to see, 150 years pass and nothing changed.
In the period of industrialization at the late 19th century or early 20th century, when there was this surge of nativist sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment and reaction, partly driven by, I think your book argues, that the recruitment of migrant labor by the these growing capitalist firms and these growing industries that needed cheap labor. I'm curious what you found and what your analysis is of the relationship between these, between these forces, each of which are exploiting or oppressing immigrant populations in different ways, sometimes at odds and sometimes kind of in harmony. How have you thought about that in your work?
Yeah, maybe before I answer that specific question, I might back up a little bit and give a little context. So although there weren't any US immigration restrictions until the first is in 1875 and then the most sweeping in 1882, the US did have citizenship rules from the very beginning. In 1790, the Naturalization Act limited citizenship to a free white person, right? And so what happens after the Civil War? The white population has to deal with this new reality of granting citizenship to former slaves and African Americans by 1870. And I think you can see the restrictions on immigration very much tied to reckoning with what non-white citizenship meant for these white supremacist people at that time. And so the sense was that there was certainly a series of reactions to that. And I think you can see Jim Crow laws and the violence of the KKK, and then efforts as one response to Black citizenship. A second response is an effort to remove Black people, right? There's the American Colonization Society, which tries to recruit Blacks to move back to Africa, right? And sends thousands of people back to Liberia and doesn't even disband until 1964. But the third response, and this was very explicit in the politics of the era, is that we have this one race problem, the white leaders would say. The last thing we need to do is to create another one by allowing non-white people to immigrate. And so the history of immigration restrictions is really a reaction to each non-white group that starts to arrive, right? It's the Chinese first, then Japanese, then it's Southern and Eastern Europeans, right? And so each new immigration, and then much later Mexican, is met with new restrictions on it, right? To kind of prevent this expanding the body of who can belong in the United States.
There's a sense that I have that these processes and these movements were really building momentum in the first decades of the 20th century, kind of culminating in the national origins quotas. Can you walk us through, not only that specific legislation, but kind of what were the forces that built to that moment that even today, anti-immigrant activists, politicians, and nativists will point to and say that this was kind of the, as an example of what they want to recreate. How did that come to pass in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's tied to what we were just discussing, that era, the last decades of the 19th century, is a period where the white population of the United States is trying to reckon with their position of power in the country and justify the exclusion of freed slaves from participation in that, right? So they do it through violence, through Jim Crow laws, but there's also an effort in universities to create a kind of a justification for it. And so it's at this period that we see a race pseudoscience develop at the elite universities. Harvard, MIT, Columbia are the centers of this thinking, which creates this notion that there is this hierarchy of races. And at the top of that is the white race. And then that's above the other races from around the world. And crucial to this thinking during this period is not just a white race, but rather that there is an elite white race in the form of the Nordic people, which are Northern Western Europeans, that even within Europeans, you can see a hierarchy where Nordic at this time is described as superior to other Middle Southern Europeans. And so the development of these immigration laws, in particularly the 1924 national origins quotas, is built onto that eugenics scaffolding that is produced at Harvard and MIT and Columbia. The argument being that the US at the time has a very large percentage of Nordic white people, but they're threatened by these immigrations from other places. By 1917, all Asian immigration is banned, but there was still free immigration from Europe during that period. And so in 1921, we see the emergency quotas to prevent refugees after World War I coming into the United States, which puts a very small quota on the arrival of people from Europe, specifically focused on preventing Jewish immigration, but also Italian and Greek immigration. And then in 1924, those are made permanent. And the idea is to shift the orientation of who can come to the country back towards those Nordic white people who had been the people arriving through most of the 1800s, but it had shifted by the turn of the 20th century to Southern and Eastern Europeans.
Something that I really appreciate about the book, and it is kind of the focus in some sections, and then it is a undercurrent in other sections, but it is really quite consistent, is the ways that you show how the development of so-called race science and eugenics is really an elite project. And this is something that, as you said, was cultivated in universities, partially as a justification for existing practices, but then in being developed, kind of filters out and motivates further practices like these restrictive immigration laws. There's one institution in particular that emerges from this ferment, and that casts quite a long shadow that I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, because I suspect that some of the audience members, even if they haven't yet read, well, they haven't read your book, but might have heard a little bit about an organization called the Pioneer Fund. So I wonder if you can tell us about the history of that particular group, its origins, and then what its legacy is, because I think it's important, and is frequently kind of held up as like a bogeyman. And so it's important to understand, like, what actually were they up to?
Yeah, so the Pioneer Fund, so after the national origin quotas go into place in 1924, which were, for example, praised by Hitler in Mein Kampf. Hitler was in prison in 1924 writing Mein Kampf, and he holds up the US's 1924 immigration law as the model that Germany should follow. And he uses that as a model for his ideas with the rise of the Nazi Party. By the 1930s, though, those ideas in the US are starting to be questioned. At least at a scholarly level, people question the eugenics that's the basis of those laws, and that kind of hard racial science of that era starts to fall out of favor. And so the Pioneer Fund is something that emerges in that period as a counterweight to that. So there was a wealthy New Yorker named Wycliffe Draper, who was reclusive but inherited a large amount of money, and he believed very strongly in eugenics. And so he was concerned when that started to be less popular. And so he decided to use his wealth to support scholars, to support publications that were in favor of eugenics. And the first thing they published was a film from the Nazis that had been produced. He paid for that to be distributed in the United States. That's the first thing the Pioneer Fund did. And it continued to exist even after Wycliffe Draper died in the 1970s. So during the 60s, they funded white citizen councils in the South. They were funding efforts to overturn Brown versus the Board of Education. But after he dies in the 1970s, it becomes this key fund for white supremacists during an era when there was a lot less support for them, right? So it's got millions of dollars in its foundation. They invest it and use that to produce a constant flow of money to support white supremacist causes. And it becomes essentially the one source of money of substantial money for white supremacists in that 70s and 80s era.
That is also foreshadowing something that something and someone that we will be talking about in a little bit. But before we go there, I want to say, so to kind of put a bow on this part of our conversation, I think that much of this book and much of your work generally shows persuasively, in my opinion, the continuities and legacies of race science, eugenics, Jim Crow regime, and other historical forms of white supremacy that shape the thinking around immigration in the United States, all of which is necessary to show that someone like Donald Trump, the policies he enacted, and the movement and support around him, from donors to voters to right-wing media, are not anomalous or a deviation from US history, but inheritors of a long tradition of racism and nativism in which even well-meaning liberals are implicated. All of that having been said, and this is kind of another version of a question that I asked before, I'm curious to know what, if anything, you find to be new, different, or surprising about the way that racism and nativism function today compared to their historical forms. Just to say, we live in a very different world than Dennis Kearney or V.S. McClatchy, and yet the kinds of movements that they participated in are still ongoing and still powerful. So how have they changed? How are they different? How are they the same?
Yeah. One thing I've noticed is when we saw Donald Trump and his like the Muslim ban or separating children from their families at the border, putting kids in cages. We see it again with the current Biden administration with the treatment of these Haitian refugees, forcing them to live in squalid conditions under a bridge and then deporting them almost immediately without giving consideration to their asylum claims. People react to that by saying, this is not who we are. This is un-American, right? This doesn't represent what America is, right? And my reaction to that is, no, this is exactly what America is, right? This is what America has been doing for decades, right? It was founded on the idea of a country for free white persons. And as each non-white group of immigrants has arrived at the border, new restrictions have been put in place to prevent them from entering the country. So it's exactly who America is, right? The real question is, what do we want America to become, right, in the future? But it's really much in line with what's been happening over a long period of time. To answer your question a little more directly, what's changed? I think the one thing that the anomalous period maybe is really the period after the civil rights movement through the early 2000s, right? That's a period where it was no longer okay for white supremacists to explicitly say white supremacist things, right? They didn't cease to exist, but they had to suppress those thoughts, right? They had to stay at the fringes of political discourse or hide those views. I think what's happened over the last 20 years, I think it starts with anti-Muslim speaking after September 11th. It became okay to speak against Muslims in a way that maybe wouldn't have been prior to that event. And then Trump further opens that door by using these explicitly racist language to describe immigrants. It kind of reemerges. It allows these things that used to be common in American discourse to be said again. Whether they disappeared through that period of time, I would say no, probably they didn't disappear, but they were at least repressed for a period of time. And we see that with someone like Tucker Carlson, for example, explicitly using the replacement theory and talking about it every day on his highly rated television show. So it's shocking to hear, even though it is in line with the history of the country.
Yeah, I mean, there does seem to me to be something significant about the fact that, Tucker Carlson's embrace of the Great Replacement. Actually, can you gloss for the audience what is the Great Replacement theory, so-called Great Replacement theory, as advocated by someone like Tucker Carlson?
Yeah, so the replacement theory, so what I suggest in my book, the replacement theory comes up throughout the book, because from my perspective, US immigration policy has really been about preventing the replacement of white people since the beginning, right? That's been the purpose, to not allow non-white people to immigrate to the country, to protect white privilege in the country. But the replacement theory is that that's the threat that the white population faces today. Some people might frame it as Western civilization is under threat by people immigrating from other parts of the world. Other people explicitly will say, like Tucker Carlson has said, that non-white immigration represents the threat of the extinction of white people. This same idea has had different names throughout the history of the country. At the turn of the last century, the term they used was race suicide. So Teddy Roosevelt talked quite a bit about the threat of immigration, and that represented the suicide of the white race if too many non-white people were allowed to immigrate to the country. Calvin Coolidge, who signed the national origin quotas into law, talked about keeping America American, right, as his framework. Other people use language of white genocide as another term for that, the death of the West. There are a lot of different phrases to represent the replacement of a dominant white population with a multicultural population. And so essentially it's a white supremacist position, and it has been a common argument of white supremacists for decades, but has not been something that was said in mainstream public discourse for a long time, really since the 1960s, as segregation came to an end and the civil rights movement won the argument, at least in the public discourse, about race in the United States.
Yeah, and not to veer back into media theory, but it does seem that it's important. It seems important that another kind of structural difference is that even if these ideas were circulating, and not just circulating, but in some periods hegemonic, 100 years ago, you didn't have someone with the reach and the audience of Tucker Carlson saying these things so explicitly, per se. That there's just a kind of different media ecosystem now and information ecosystem now.
I think to add to that, I think that the rise of things like YouTube and social media is also playing, and Facebook, of course, plays a big role in that, because in the 1970s or 80s, there were certainly people that had these views, but it was much harder for them to connect with each other and to disseminate these views to other people. Whereas the rise of the internet and of YouTube allows anyone to post anything that they want, right? And as we saw with YouTube, it also, there was a favoring for more extreme content, right? And so I think that those changes in the last 20 years really allowed the reemergence of this sort of extremist view about race to gain a foothold that it did not have prior to that. Mm-hmm. Can I jump in? Because,
yeah.
You know, we're mostly talking about my book, which I appreciate, but you've also written a really great book, right? Which is Blood Red Lines, that came out earlier this year. And it seems like what we're talking about right now is something that you could speak to a little bit. You know, I wanted to ask you, in your book, you talk about border fascism as a concept that you introduce. And so I wondered if you could talk about that as an idea, and when you're talking about it, explain to us how kind of the anti-immigrant groups get linked up with other fascist groups, or are they essentially the same thing?
Yes, thank you. Blood Red Lines, how nativism fuels the right, available from Haymarket and Politics and Prose. You can buy it today. Okay, so yes, our books do cover a lot of similar ground. One of the arguments that my book makes, and that I would say is an argument that I'm still developing and kind of taking in new information and refining. But yeah, that we are living in a period where the forces of reaction and social movements that are animated by reactionary politics are developing into a new ideological mode that I call border fascism, which is a term that I kind of appropriate or borrow from scholarship on classical fascism and the Mussolini regime in Italy. And I think that, I mean, as is kind of the subtext of several of my questions to you, is I'm very interested in or concerned with or kind of sensitive to, while being very attentive to all of the continuities and all of the histories and legacies that are informing the politics of this moment, still feeling a sense that we have entered to use a sort of jargony word, like a new conjuncture or a different conjuncture that is producing forms of politics that have particular qualities and characters that I don't want to say they're unprecedented, but that are just kind of new and unfamiliar. I think that specifically the significance of the border as a discursive tool, as a political tool, as a kind of space in both like reality, but also in people's imagination, is taking on new power as like neoliberalism enters a new phase of crisis. That the instability and the volatility of the like global economy since the neoliberal turn of the 70s and 80s is provoking the development of new kinds of reactionary politics. And it's still kind of nascent and fractured, but it seems to me that there is a through line through this. And it's so, but then to complicate my own position is that this through line, as your book shows, goes all the way back to the beginning. So it's not unique to this moment, anti-immigrant politics or nativist politics by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, those politics were central to classical fascist movements. But to me, the emergence of a kind of border security complex and industry, the coinciding with the development of mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex, and all of these weird things that are happening in social media, like, is producing a strange new politics.
Yeah.
That is currently in I don't want to say a state of remission, but following January 6th and the Capitol riot, there has been a crackdown from the federal government on far-right organizing that has had a demobilizing effect in many ways. That's also meant that the federal government and the security state has accrued more power to itself, which is not per se something that is good either.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think we're thinking about similar things.
Yeah, I think one place, and I see we're almost time for questions, and so we can go to that in a second. But one figure that overlaps between our two books that really takes up a third of each of our books, and I think we're among the first people to really write about this person as well, is John Tanton, right? So the question that we kind of led up to a minute ago, which was, after the civil rights movement, white supremacy fell to the side, but then it suddenly had this reemergence, right? And who did that? What's the story behind that? And I think both you and I end up with John Tanton as the answer to that question. And he is this larger than life figure but also someone, he's been called the most influential American that most people have never heard of, right? And he in the book, I spend a lot of chapters on him, looking at how he starts in the environmental movement, and working on issues of environmental conservation, but then kind of is always dabbling with these white supremacists as well. And eventually he reaches the position that to protect Americans and the American environment, that the US has to have strict immigration laws. And he founds all of these organizations, starting with FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform in 1979, through Numbers USA, Center for Immigration Studies, Immigration Reform Law Institute, and dozens more that become this kind of seem like a grassroots movement for extreme immigration restrictions. But as you and I show in the book, they're all founded by the same guy. And a lot of their money comes from a single person. There's this woman, Cordelia Scaife May, who was an heir of the Mellon Foundation, a Mellon fortune, who by the 1990s was the wealthiest woman in the United States. And when she dies, she leaves $420 million to a foundation. And that foundation funds these extremist anti-immigrant hate groups. So they're extremely well funded, and it allows them to kind of seep into the public discourse. They don't look like what you think white supremacists look like, right? They're wearing suits. They speak well when they go on NPR, but they're still hate groups, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so I think where our books overlap is to tell the story of John Tanton and the influence that he's had on our modern day society. And of course, he leads directly to people like Stephen Miller, right? Stephen Miller his emails that were leaked a few years ago showed that he was in touch once a week with people from these anti-immigrant hate groups while Trump was running for president. So getting talking points, developing the speeches directly from the writings of these hate groups. And then after they become the administration, as I show in my book, they hire 16 people from hate groups into the US government to work in immigration, in the Justice Department, in the Department of Homeland Security, which is unprecedented for someone that used to work at a hate group to end up in the White House working there. So the impact that Trump administration had on immigration, you can see it directly from that. And I think both you and I link that directly back to that single man, John Tanton.
Yeah, we have a more of a comment than a question here from Carol, and saying, please follow Hassan Ahmad for his work on John Tanton, including suing the University of Michigan to release his archives. I know that you know Hassan. I also know, have corresponded with Hassan, but tell us a little bit about his work.
Yeah, so Hassan is a lawyer, and he's featured in my book. I definitely tell some of his stories in the chapters about the Muslim ban, for example. But John Tanton donated his papers to the University of Michigan, to this place called the Bentley Historical Library. But in the early 2000s, Heidi Birich from the Southern Poverty Law Center went there and started looking through these archives and finding all of this correspondence with white supremacists and publishing that information. And so Tanton decided that he needed it to be closed. And so they closed everything after 1991. And so about a third of the archive is available, but the last 2/3 of it really through the early 2000s, when this movement was really growing and the money from the Colcom Foundation was flowing into it, that's all closed at the moment. So Hassan is suing the University of Michigan to open up those records and to release them into the public domain. And the lawsuit is ongoing, but they've been winning some of the early test questions that have been coming up. John Tanton passed away in 2019, so he's no longer alive.
As I recall, many of those boxes that are still sealed are labeled Pioneer Fund. So there is definitely some interesting stuff in there. Let's see. So we have a question from Carrie. How is today's situation at the southern border different from Irish and Italian immigrants? They were white, but were still discriminated against. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process by which some immigrant groups are able to assimilate after having been subject to oppression and some are not.
Yeah. I think the first thing is to say that our definitions of white have varied over time. One of the things that I talk about in the book is court efforts to define free white person, right? So the Naturalization Act in 1790 said citizenship was limited to free white persons, and then people of African ancestry were added in 1870. But that remained in place until 1952, free white person. So in the 19-teens and 20s, there were a series of court cases about who counts as white, right? And so I detail in the book, you know, in one court, someone from India is white. In another court, they're not white. Here, Armenians are white. There, Armenians are not white. So there was a lot of effort to determine exactly what white even means. And I think that a lot of that, the scholarly work that I was talking about at the turn of the last century was, much of it was about moving Italians out of being white, right? And, you know, probably the most influential book of that period is The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant. And in that book, he uses this very clear hierarchy of Nordic as the top category. And then he keeps a middle category and a bottom category for the Mediterranean type Southern Europeans. And for him, the book says that Nordic people are the white man par excellence, right? And that these other sub races, as the term he uses in the book, are lesser. So although we treat Italian as white today, I don't think that in 1924 that was a widely held view, right? There was certainly contestation of who even counts as white. But to get to what Brendan has suggested is W.E.B. Du Bois has made the argument that after the Civil War and Reconstruction, there was I don't know what the best way to phrase it, but like an effort to appease poor whites by giving them the privileges of race against Black people in exchange for continuing to accept the economic inequality that they were living in during that time, right? So that in their actual economic situation, their financial livelihood, they were not doing well, poor whites during this period, but they got to keep that privilege of being above the Blacks in a Jim Crow system, right? So it kind of consolidates this idea of whiteness as privilege vis-a-vis other groups, right? So that what I'm trying to say is that white as a category was something that was certainly undefined and being firmed up during this era as there were efforts to exclude people who were not included in it.
Thank you. We have a question from Nandita Sharma, whose book I will be reading later this semester. Radhika I'm gonna not pronounce this correctly. Radhika Manjia, as well as myself, have written about the importance of paying attention to the form that state sovereignty takes, e.g. imperial or national. Arguably, the US attempted to act as an imperial state until the late 19th century. After the 1875 Page Act, one could argue that the US nationalized its sovereignty. Question: can we not see racist immigration controls as central to the logic of the national form of state power? Doesn't challenging racist or fascist immigration controls therefore require us to reject nationalism writ large and the institution of national sovereignty? Thanks, Reece. Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's also a very big question. But I think that definitely Nandita is right? To see a transition at the end of the 19th century in terms of what the United States was doing, right? So, because if you think when the US was established in the late 1700s, it's 13 colonies in the eastern part of the country. And so there is this massive period of expansion, what she's describing as an imperial period, where the US is gobbling up the territory of former Native American groups, displacing them, killing them, and claiming those lands, right? So it's absolutely this expansionary period where there was a need for more people, right? So that's why you don't see limits on white immigration during that period. Instead, there's an effort to bring more people to help with this project of conquering and taking over in this imperial vision. By the late 1800s, the outlines of the mainland US is set, right? It's really set in 1852 with the end of the Mexican-American War and the land that the US has taken during that period of time. And so in those later decades, there's an effort of kind of defining who belongs in that, right? And I think that's that national form of sovereignty that she's talking about, where there's that idea of, trying to push Africans back to Africa. People of Mexican origin and Native Americans are pushed out of the Southwest. After the Chinese Exclusion Acts, Chinese people are forced out of the United States as well. That's a phenomenon that I think a lot of people are completely unaware of. But in 1882, there were 110,000 people of Chinese origin in the United States. By 1920, there were only 60,000, right? And so, and that's a period of time, a 4-year period, where the population of the US doubled during that time, right? So it's a period of population growth where the Chinese population was cut in half. And that's through town after town across the West, banding together and forcing Chinese people out of their towns. They're fleeing to Mexico, they're fleeing to Canada, they're heading back to China, right? So there's an ethnic cleansing that follows the Chinese Exclusion Act. So yeah, I think that I lost track of the end of Nandita's question in the middle of talking about that, but I think the point of it, right, is that sovereignty and the state is predicated on this idea of a national group that it represents, right? And so that exclusion is inherent to the way that the sovereign state operates, and I think that's right.
Yeah, I think the question was, does challenging racist or fascist immigration controls require us to reject nationalism writ large and the institution of national sovereignty? So I do think that you answered that. But there's an earlier question from Jim Brocker, the context for which has now been lost. I'm not sure exactly what he was responding to, but the question is, what was the opposition to this pervasive racism? So I think how I would like to expand on that question is to ask you to talk about over the course of this history of nativism and the anti-immigrant reaction, where forms of immigrants organizing for themselves to push back against these racist policies, and forms of solidarity that emerged between immigrant communities and existing resident people in the United States, and how that has changed over time, because I know that there have been significant changes even in the past 20 years.
Yeah, I think, I guess I perceive his question to be asking about some of those earlier eras, right? So when like the Chinese Exclusion Act is passing, for example, and in the book, I do highlight some of those for sure. There, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was debated in 1882, it passed by about a 2-to-1 vote, essentially. And there were some impassioned speeches against it, right? And for example, there was a senator from Massachusetts named George Frisbee Hoare, who was a Republican, who argued that it was the antithesis of what the United States was founded on, right? That the United States was founded on equality and openness and freedom. And so excluding people just based on their skin color ran completely in the face of that. And so he argues for a borderless world, essentially, in 1882. He's saying that everyone on the face of the earth should be able to move freely across it. And that entry into a country shouldn't be based on the color of someone's skin, but by their character, right? In some ways, kind of presaging the words of Martin Luther King Jr. 80 years later. So there certainly were people speaking out against these things and writing against these things. W.B. Du Bois is another example of that, writing in the 1930s, kind of explaining how this white identity is formed in that Reconstruction period. So there certainly is a lot of that that's happening, and we see it today, right? Although the loud anti-immigrant voices get a lot of attention. If you look at surveys about Americans' perceptions of immigrants, right? The Pew Trust has done a survey since the 1990s asking Americans whether immigrants benefit or harm the country. In the 1990s, the number was like 60% said they harm and like 20% said they benefit. Today, it has the highest number of people in that survey saying that immigrants benefit the country. And it's higher than the number who say that it harms, right? So although we tend to perceive that we're living in this anti-immigrant moment, the reality is that a lot of people continue to support immigrants and see the benefits that they provide to society. We don't have time to go through all of those things, but if you look at any measure of whether immigrants benefit the United States, it's a positive benefit in terms of the economic impacts, the cultural impacts. There is no economic case for limiting immigration restrictions. Instead, as I argue in the book, immigration restrictions are fundamentally about race. And so if you want to see a world that doesn't have, if you want to see the United States moving away from the white supremacist past, one of the key things that needs to be changed is the idea that we have immigration restrictions.
This seems to be, gesturing towards a kind of conclusive moment. I wonder if there's any kind of parting comments that you want to leave us with, or actually another way to end it would maybe be to ask you if there are lingering questions that you have that you were not able to fully grapple in this book that you're still thinking about.
Yeah. So one of the things, when I started writing this book, I also focused a lot on the Border Patrol, because the Border Patrol was established in 1924, 2 days after the national origin quotas went into force, right? So the Border Patrol was established as an institution to enforce racial exclusion at the border. And it's something that they've continued to do through the present day, right? I mean, you see that very explicitly with the treatment of these Haitian people who've arrived in the last few weeks. That's what they were founded to do. The Border Patrol is allowed to do racial profiling. In the 1970s, there were a series of Supreme Court cases that legalized racial profiling for the Border Patrol, and they continue to do that through the present moment. So after I finished this book, what I did next was write a book about the Border Patrol, and to think about them as a very dangerous police force in the US that's has a pernicious impact on the country. And that book comes out next year. So that's the thing that follows this one.
I'm looking forward to it. Be sure to pre-order it from Politics and Prose when there is a link.
Well, on behalf of Politics and Prose, I'd like to thank you both for a very interesting discussion, very well-informed discussion. Although I do have one last thing, sorry to surprise you, but I have a question that we tend to ask our authors here, and that would be and this is for both of you, by the way, if you are currently reading something, could you please share that with everyone?
Sure. So I've got it right in front of me. So I'm reading Border and Rule by Harsha Walia. which is a really excellent book that looks at the impacts of immigration restrictions, but looks at it at a global scale, right? So along the lines of the question that Nandita asked about what's the relationship between sovereignty and immigration restrictions and capitalism, Harshawalia makes that big case that those things are fundamentally connected to each other and that you can't tackle one of those issues without looking at the others.
I am finally reading, several years late to the party, Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend, the first of the Neapolitan novels. And let me tell you, they should make a TV show out of this because it's great. Everyone's right. They really are lovely books. Yeah, that's what I'm reading right now.
Thank you very much. Once again, thank you to everyone who's tuned in to this event. Please, once again, go to the chat section, purchase a copy of not only the book you're here for, but also the book that is here from our guest author. Purchase multiple copies. You know, they all make good gifts. On behalf of Politics and Prose, once again, I'd like to say thank you all, stay well, and stay well read. Have a good one, everyone.